Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. Today we are going to talk about a book called What Paul Meant. It's by Garry Wills. It's published by Viking, and I want to thank you very much for stopping by. Mr. Wills is the author of several New York Times bestsellers, among them What Jesus Meant, Papal Sin, and Why I Am a Catholic. And he also won a Pulitzer Prize for a book called Lincoln at Gettysburg. So we're very honored to have you. Thanks.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
You know, what Paul meant involves us with talking about Paul and what he wrote and a little bit about why he wrote them, the letters. But when you start talking about him, I think there are a couple of things we have to contend with. You mentioned that Paul is seen by many as a stumbling block. For example, Paul, rather than Judas, they say, deserves the title Supreme Betrayer of Jesus. Where does that come from?
Well, it comes from a number of places. It comes from the Gnostics in the 2nd century. It comes from people in the Middle Ages. But it mainly comes from people reacting against the reading of Paul by Luther and Calvin. Reading of Paul as saying that we are trapped in original sin, we can't do anything about it, faith and not works will save us, or Calvin says our being trapped shows that we are predestined to salvation or damnation, and there's nothing we can do about that. Both of those men traced their thought and claimed that they were building on Paul, especially a passage from the letter to the Romans. I think it's a totally misunderstood passage, and in fact, Lutheran scholars themselves are now saying that Luther misread Paul.
Now, the other thing is that there are some people who say that the translations tend to distort what Paul was trying to say. You write, Paul's writings are the first to reach us from a follower of Jesus, and it's hard to avoid anachronism when we try to re-enter Paul's world, to avoid terms that did not exist for Paul. I remember when I was reading the book, this was very uncomfortable. When am I going to hear Christian? When am I going to hear church? And terms like that, Christian church, priest, sacraments, conversion, all such terms, subtly or not so subtly, pervert what was being said in its original situation. And to put an atmosphere of religion on all that was going on with Paul is really to do something he would be opposed to.
That's right. The followers of Jesus at the time, who were called the brothers and the sisters, were a very egalitarian, informal group. And the words that we use about them are often mistranslations. For instance, church. The word that's translated church is ekklesia in Greek. It means gathering. It's used only once in the Gospels. It's used all the time in Paul because, of course, he's addressing the gatherings. But when he talks about the gatherings, these are house meetings. And he doesn't write to a leader. There were no leaders. He writes to the gathering. That's so much in his mind that when he talks about his fellow believers in Jesus, he says they are my house fellows, oikei. There is no church, there is no Christianity, and the latter one is the most important. Now, Christos in Greek means Messiah, and when he uses it, he's always talking about the Messiah. The Jewish Messiah is the only thing he preaches, whether to Gentiles or to Jews, and there are no Christians. That's a word that was invented to criticize and attack the followers of Jesus at the end of the 1st century. They're the brothers and sisters. So when people talk about him being converted from Judaism to Christianity, there was no Christianity. There was only believers in Jesus, whether they were ethnically from the nations, which is what Gentiles means, or ethnically from the Jews. They were all brothers and sisters believing in the Jewish Messiah. So in a way, they were all Jews. When he preached to the Gentiles, as we call them, he preached out of the Jewish scripture. It's the only scripture there was. There wasn't any New Testament. That hadn't been written yet. He never thought of himself, his letters, as going into anything. And if anybody had told him, your letters will be used against the Jewish sacred writings, he would say, horrors, that's not what I want. So it's very important not to be anachronistic about these things, not to have, not to speak even of, say, conversion. Probably he's most famous for having a conversion. He never had a conversion. There was nothing for him to be converted to. He would have been astonished if you told him that he was converted. He was a Jew.
He was a Jew.
Who saw
first, last, and always.
Right, who believed in the Jewish Messiah. There was no Christianity for him to be converted to.
Now, the letters of Paul, which are what he left behind, so to speak, are, not what we might expect them to be. They're really occasional writings dictated on the run. And there's no, developed sense to them. Nothing happened at leisure. It was all done like that.
That's right. You have to remember that when he went around and talked to people, this was an oral culture. And all of these things were spread orally. And he reports the things that he received orally, creeds and hymns and baptismal formulae and the Eucharist. So the normal way people encountered Paul, he would have expounded the meaning of Jesus to them in a connected way. The only reason he writes letters, writing was a rare thing.
Yeah. Let's hold that for the minute, and we'll pick up on that when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
What Paul Meant is the book. Garry Wills is the author, and the publisher is Viking. And it just recently received a very interesting review in the Los Angeles Times, which we will read in part. What makes Wills a contribution unique in a country where shelves of religious books these days overflow with vitriol, bombast, and treacle is his singular combination of intellectual integrity and authentically unsentimental spirituality. And they're right about that, I think. Read What Paul Meant to get a sense of what the preacher from Tarsus really intended and for what Garry Wills has to offer us all. That's great. Congratulations.
Yeah, that is.
Yeah. I want to get back to the letters themselves and some of the things you say about them. I think it's important. These are occasional writings dictated in the midst of various struggles. We never see pure Pauline thought being developed at leisure by its own inner logic. Paul is a mystic and a deep theologian, but also a voluble street fighter. What a combination.
Yes. Well, you did not normally write or read in his world. It was an oral culture. You did things by oral preaching and receiving and hearing, and people's memories are very good in all oral cultures. So the only time he had to write was when he was talking to a gathering that he was familiar with, but he was away from it. And they had some particular problem they brought up, and he's a troubleshooter. He has to come, he has to send and try to reconcile warring factions. You have to remember that he didn't write the things himself. Nobody wrote in those days. They dictated. There was a world of scribes, stenographers, etc. And when he dictated a letter, he had scribes even in prison with him. When Jerome went into the desert to be a hermit, he took his scribes with him. You had to have.
Yeah.
He would dictate, and then the scribes would copy out the letter they were going to send, and they would make a number of copies because you can't count on one reaching the goal. And he also sent them to other gatherings, especially later on, and he had to keep copies for himself to verify what he had said. So there's a whole industry of that, but it had to exist because reading was so rare. When the message was received at a gathering, people wouldn't read it. You didn't own books, for instance. It would have been read to them. So that they would hear it orally, and he dictated it orally. So writing was a rare thing. It was very clumsy. Written things were written on papyrus scrolls. They're all rolled up. We go to chapter something, verse something. You can't do that with a scroll. You have to open it and use both your hands, and you don't know where anything is. And when it's rolled up, you tie it up so that it won't flop open. And so you put a little scrap around the outside which tells you what's inside, so you don't have to open it and find out. So reading was a very clumsy operation. It was not what the normal person did. So these letters are not what Paul would have been doing and how most people would have been receiving and hearing him. But, of course, they're very valuable to us because they're the first. They're written 20 and 30 and 40 years before the Gospels. And also, it's very important to have him show the controversies in the early gatherings. You know, there's a myth that there was a kind of pure early church that had no conflict, and then later on, people added dogma.
That's the way we were brought up.
Yeah, people added dogma and all that kind of thing. What we find out is that the Jesus movement spread explosively, originally across the Middle East and then into Greece and Rome. And they were fighting all the time because this was so new that they had trouble finding out how they should cope with it all. He himself had attacked the idea that Jesus was the Messiah. And then he had to say, wait a minute, he is the Messiah, and I can prove it from the Scriptures. And he has to argue that point.
It really put him in a bad situation.
Yes.
One of the other things that you bring out in the book is what goes on or doesn't go on, I don't know how to say this, between Paul and Luke. I mean, Luke in your book comes off as a bad guy in a way. I mean, I think at one point you call him a theological artist.
Yes, he is that. Well, remember, Luke is writing toward the end of the first century. He's writing half a century at least after Paul. And he does have a theological agenda. Mm-hmm. The temple has fallen in 70. The Christians fled from the Jewish war, the war between the Jews and the Romans. They've been deracinated from their origins. You know, all of our stuff, all of our New Testament is written outside the land where Jesus preached and lived and died. And so at that time, Luke is trying to reconnect the movement to its now almost disappeared Jerusalem roots. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem he has to face.
Okay. Well, when we come back, one of the things I want to get into is one of the things that Paul is accused of, and that is that he was against women. We'll check out that charge when we come back.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Follow us on Twitter at JimFosterCoc or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. It is Conversations on the Coast. What Paul Meant is the book. Garry Wills is the author who is with us. John Meacham, just recently made the editor of Newsweek, has this to say about what Paul meant. With characteristic clarity and insight, Garry Wills has given us a vital study of the earliest voice in the New Testament, and that's something that you harp on over and over again, and it's very, very important.
That's right.
Because he doesn't have the accretions that the later writers have, and we can get no closer to Jesus than through the writings of Paul. And Wills's book expertly separates fact from fiction and history from legend, illuminating those epical early years after the Passion. It is true, as Paul said, that we see through a glass darkly, but Wills has now helped us to see the theology of the most important apostle much more clearly. That's from John Meacham. Again, I congratulate you. These are important people we've got here saying nice things about the book. Now, one of the not nice things that was said about our friend Paul is that he was against women.
That's right.
And he wasn't, really. I mean...
No, you know, that's when I say that I said that I was writing about Paul, uniformly women say, oh, I don't like him. And in a way they shouldn't, for the way that he's been presented. You have to begin with this. There are 13 letters attributed to him in the New Testament, but modern scholars say there are only 7 that he wrote. Mm-hmm. And the pastoral ones, the last 3, are at the end of the first century, a whole cultural shift away from him. And you begin with a passage in Timothy, the letter to Timothy, saying that women should not speak in church. They should not. They should listen to their husbands and learn from their husbands. Well, Paul didn't say that. Now, there is a passage in an authentic letter to the Corinthians which does say women should not speak up in church. But earlier in the very same letter, he says, when women prophesy in church, and prophesying was a high spiritual gift then. It's not the ordinary woman just speaking off the top of her head. When they prophesy in church, they should wear veils. Well, if they're prophesying in church, they're obviously speaking in church.
They sure are.
That last one is clearly an interpolation by people who said, wait a minute, we can't let him contradict his letter to Timothy. So they changed it. They rewrote him in many ways. For instance, he names about 10 women who were co-workers with him, who had high spiritual gifts, who were prophets, who were deacons, who were apostles. And he says there was an eminent apostle named Junia. And Junia was revered by the early church, was made a saint in the Orthodox Church, was praised by John Chrysostom. In the Middle Ages, they said, wait a minute, there cannot be a woman apostle. So we're going to say that he made a mistake, that he was really talking about a man named Junias. And so they changed the text. And it was easy to do because in the accusative, they both have the same form, Junia,
same form, yeah.
But there's a different accent. But there's a problem with that. Junia was a common name. Junias is never attested anywhere else. It's a made-up name. So these things were foisted on Paul, and they've made him an enemy of women when he's constantly praising women, working with them, calling them his coadjutors, my protector. He says one woman went to jail with him, another woman saved his life. So there's nothing could be falser than the idea that he's a misogynist.
Yeah, and he maintains that they are not second-class citizens.
No.
In the various gatherings.
That was the most egalitarian society on earth. And he cites a baptismal hymn, which obviously precedes him. Baptized into Messiah, there is no longer Jew or Gentile, slave or free, man or woman, but we are all one and are the same in Messiah. Men and women are the same. Now, we haven't caught up with that yet. So
that's true. We're trying sometimes.
Yes, right. But Paul can help.
Toward the end of the book, you say something that I find very, very inspiring. Religion took over the legacy of Paul as it did that of Jesus because they both opposed it. They said that the worship of God is a matter of interior love, not based on external observances, on temples or churches, on hierarchies or priesthoods. Both were at odds with those who impose the burdens of religion and punish those who try to escape them. They were radical egalitarians, though in ways that delved below and soared above conventional politics. They were on the side of the poor and saw through the rich. They saw only two basic moral duties, love of God and love of neighbor. Both were liberators, not imprisoners, so they were in prison, so they were killed. Paul meant what Jesus meant, that love is the only law. And trust me, if you have the sense to go out and buy this book, praised by the new editor of Newsweek, praised by the LA Times, that's the kind of message that you're going to get. A deep spiritual message, and in a book full of wonderful insights and scholarly work. It's called What Paul Meant. The author is Garry Wills. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Follow us on Twitter at Jim Foster COC, or send an email to jimfostercoc@gmail.com.